The men would later say that the air inside the tobacco barn felt wrong. Heavy. Watching. As if the darkness itself was waiting for something it had been promised long ago. 40 white-robed figures stood in a tight circle around a single black woman. She was unarmed, alone, outnumbered, yet she stared at them with a calm that made more than one of the masked men shift his weight in discomfort. They expected fear, screaming, begging. Instead they got something none of them were ready for. A slow, quiet smile. That night was October 14, 1871, just outside Greensboro, North Carolina. The newspapers would never mention what truly happened in that barn. The sheriff would write only a single sentence calling it a routine property inspection. But locals whispered another version. They whispered about the woman who recognized 3 of the men by how they stood and tilted their shoulders. She had seen those same bodies 9 years earlier on a bloody battlefield inside a field hospital tent where she watched the life drain out of them. That was the moment the Klansmen first felt something colder than fear. They did not know that she had been waiting for them. They did not know she knew their names before they even opened their mouths. This story begins long before that night in North Carolina. It starts more than 300 miles south, in a place where history was carefully rewritten to hide the truth. Charleston County, South Carolina, looked beautiful to the outside world with its grand porches, oak trees, and river breeze. But beneath the beauty lived a darker reputation that even other plantation owners whispered about. Charleston was proud of something few spoke of openly. Its elite believed they had perfected the art of breaking people. Along the Ashley River stood the Tidewater plantations, each property spread across endless green fields. While many plantations bragged about cotton or rice production, the Tidewater owners boasted about something else entirely. They bragged about their ability to take enslaved men and women considered too rebellious or dangerous for other plantations and turn them into obedient workers. Families across the South sent their so-called problems to these estates with one hope: that Charleston would break them. The most feared of all these plantations was the Haverford plantation. Built in 1789 and known for its brutal training methods, it changed hands twice before ending up in the possession of Colonel Augustus Haverford. His name alone made overseers straighten their posture. He paid high prices at slave markets for those marked dangerous. These were people who fought back, who ran, or who refused every command. Haverford called them excessive spirit. He kept records that showed not one escape in more than 2 decades. His secret was isolation. Thick swamp surrounded the property on 3 sides and the Ashley River blocked the 4th. Only 2 narrow dirt roads led in or out and both could be watched from the widow's walk on the roof of the main house. The woman who would later be called the Greensboro Ghost arrived at Haverford Plantation on March 3, 1862. Her real name has been erased. The bill of sale described her only as a negress approximately 19 years old, formerly property of a Beaufort County estate now liquidated. The document also noted her history of violence toward overseers. Everyone at the market knew she had killed a man in Beaufort. Since enslaved people could not legally commit murder, they called it property damage instead. Colonel Haverford examined her like he was buying a workhorse. She stood 5 feet and 8 inches tall, unusually tall for a young woman of that time. Her hands carried strange calluses. Not from cotton fields or housework. Something else had shaped them. A lazy turn in her left eye gave her a slightly unsettling appearance and overseers avoided making direct eye contact with her. She made another mistake when she refused to lower her gaze while being spoken to. The colonel corrected that mistake with methods he believed were necessary. Haverford's so-called rehabilitation followed a strict process. All new arrivals were taken to the training house. It was a brick building set away from the quarters. No one ever spoke of what happened inside. The ones who entered came out silent, obedient, changed in ways that frightened even hardened workers. On March 4 the woman was taken into the training house. 31 days later she walked out. Her back was straight, her face was blank. She moved with the same quiet obedience the colonel demanded. Whatever had been done to her inside that building, it satisfied him. At first she worked in the field gangs under an overseer named Cyrus Pitchford. He used the whip less than others, which made him almost gentle by plantation standards. He wrote in his daily reports that the new woman showed unusual stamina. She worked longer hours than many men and she did it without complaint. By summer she was moved to the small medical building. Most plantations used enslaved workers to provide basic medical care, and Haverford was no different. The white physician visited only twice a week, leaving the daily care to those who had learned by experience and necessity. Something changed the moment she stepped into the sick house. She handled bones, fevers, wounds, and herbs with a skill no one could explain. She knew how to set fractures. She knew which leaves eased pain. She knew how to stop infection before it spread. When asked where she learned, she simply stayed quiet. It never felt like defiance. It felt like she carried memories she could not speak aloud. Colonel Haverford noticed her value quickly. He gave her medical texts, simple ones with basic Latin terms, the kind he believed could not teach her more than he wanted her to know. She absorbed everything faster than the visiting physician was comfortable with. Her questions revealed knowledge far deeper than the books he allowed her to read. The war eventually reached the plantation. By late 1862 the Confederacy needed every medical building it could find. Military hospitals overflowed. Plantation sick houses became field hospitals, and Haverford's was taken for this purpose in November. The woman from Beaufort now found herself treating Confederate soldiers. Men who insisted she had no right to freedom. Men who would not have hesitated to kill her outside that medical room. On November 19 the first group of wounded soldiers arrived. 17 men, some with bullet wounds, some with shattered limbs, some with fevers so strong they shook until they passed out. It should have been like any other temporary hospital in wartime, but something was different at Haverford. It began with how quietly she moved through the room. It continued with the way she treated men she should have hated. And it would end with stories that soldiers whispered long after the war ended. Stories about the silent woman who knew exactly how long a man could cling to life before letting go. Stories that would follow her all the way to North Carolina. Stories that would one day earn her the name the Greensboro Ghost. If you want part 2, just say continue part 2. Part 2. The house where soldiers went to die. Hook. People believed Confederate soldiers died on bloody battlefields, but that was not always true. Some of them died quietly in places that were never meant to save them, places that smelled of sickness, fear, and smoke. And in one of those places, deep inside a lonely South Carolina plantation, death walked on 2 feet and wore a calm expression. The soldiers never suspected that the person healing them was also choosing who would live and who would not. What happened inside that sick house would soon become the darkest secret the Confederacy ever buried. The story continues. The plantation sick house was never meant to carry the weight it suddenly held. It was built for 8 patients at most. In November 1862 it held more than double that number. The rooms were hot, humid, and filled with the stench of blood mixed with swamp air. Men lay shoulder to shoulder, some awake and shaking, others too weak to speak. Dr. Marcus Bellingham tried to hide his panic when the first wagons arrived. He was good with normal sickness, fevers, broken bones from plowing, things people survived. But this was war medicine. These were torn muscles, shattered legs, infected wounds, and dying men who were begging to live. He had never seen anything like it. And beside him worked the woman from Beaufort. She moved through the rows of wounded men with a focus that made soldiers watch her with uneasy eyes. She did not look scared. She did not look overwhelmed. She looked like she had been doing this all her life. She knew which wounds needed help right away and which ones could wait. She could remove bullets without shaking. She cleaned and stitched wounds while men screamed. But what disturbed Dr. Bellingham most was her calm expression. She never flinched. She never looked tired. She never even seemed angry at the soldiers fighting to keep her enslaved. It was as if she saw them the way she once saw crops or tools, things that either worked or stopped working. On the 4th day, Private Edmund Vickers began burning with fever. His eyes unfocused. His body shook. Bellingham believed it was infection. He did all the standard things. Cool cloths, pain medicine, herbal teas, the normal routine. The woman sat quietly beside Vickers as he drifted in and out of sleep. 2 soldiers later said they saw her lean over his bed and adjust something near his bandages. They did not know what it was. They only knew she moved fast, almost too fast to see. Vickers died that night. Bellingham blamed the gangrene already forming in the wounded shoulder. No one questioned it. They wrapped the body in canvas and buried it under a gray South Carolina sky. The next death came 3 days later. Corporal James Lindsay. Same symptoms. Same ending. By the end of December, 12 out of 17 soldiers were dead. Bellingham wrote long reports trying to explain why. But no report mentioned the woman from Beaufort. No report mentioned the strange way she watched the dying men as if reading something inside their bodies. Fresh wounded men arrived in January. The pattern continued. Men who should have lived died. Men with minor injuries recovered fast. The woman prepared all the bodies with steady, silent hands. Then February 1863 arrived with someone different. Captain Theodore Wainscott. Educated, sharp-minded, observant. He had worked in a pharmacy before the war. He listened. He watched. He noticed details others ignored. On his third night he watched the woman mix his evening medicine. She paused, looked at the door, then quietly added something from a small bottle she kept hidden in her apron. She gave him the cup with the same calm expression she always wore. Wainscott pretended to swallow the mixture and spat it out when she turned away. He lay awake the entire night hearing his own heartbeat, imagining what would have happened if he had taken that drink. The next morning his fever was nearly gone. Bellingham praised himself. But Wainscott knew the truth. Someone had tried to kill him. He began watching her closely. She moved differently around certain men. She lingered by beds of officers and wealthy soldiers. She almost rushed past poor farmers. Some men worsened for no clear reason. Others improved even when their infections looked terrible. She kept small glass bottles in her apron. Unlabeled. Always with her. She said they were herbal tinctures. Wainscott knew better. He had seen mixtures like that used to kill rats. He waited 2 weeks before speaking to Colonel Haverford. He told the colonel everything. The strange movements. The hidden bottles. The pattern in deaths. Haverford listened with a polite smile and then dismissed him. The woman was obedient. She had saved lives. Bellingham trusted her. Wainscott must be confused from the injury. He should rest. Wainscott recovered. But the fear stayed with him. On the day he returned to his regiment he warned 2 other survivors, Lieutenant Patrick Hornsby and Private Calvin Strickland. He begged them to watch her. They laughed. A slave killing soldiers in a hospital sounded insane. 2 weeks later Lieutenant Hornsby died suddenly. Doctors said his heart failed. 3 days later Strickland lost feeling in his legs. The paralysis crawled up his body until it stopped his lungs. Bellingham believed he had eaten spoiled food. The woman prepared both bodies without a single word. Spring came. The war grew bloodier. The Confederacy needed more beds. The plantation expanded the hospital into a tobacco barn and an overseer's cottage. Bellingham was overwhelmed and leaned heavily on the woman. She cared for most patients while he focused on the worst ones. Haverford saw an opportunity. He invited officers to tour the hospital. He showed off the woman as proof of loyal slaves helping the cause. Visitors praised her skill. No one noticed the quiet calculation in her eyes. The death toll rose and rose. But across the South the same thing was happening. Disease, infection, and poor supplies killed soldiers everywhere. Comparisons were impossible. Hidden in the chaos, the woman continued her work. She continued choosing. In August a Union raid forced the Army to move all patients to a real military hospital in Columbia. For 6 weeks, no soldiers died at Haverford. Enslaved workers recovered faster. No sudden sickness. No unexplained organ failure. Doctors in Columbia noticed that many soldiers improved after leaving Haverford. One doctor wrote that the men complained of feeling watched there. Of feeling unsafe. They could not explain why. In October the soldiers returned to Haverford. Major Robert Cunningham, a wealthy plantation owner from Georgia, died first. He spent his last hours fighting for breath, organs shutting down one by one. The woman sat with him until the end. When he finally saw the truth in her face, he tried to warn the others. His tongue refused to move. She closed his eyes for him. By December 87 soldiers had died. Somewhere in the shadows of that plantation, the Greensboro ghost was beginning to wake. If you want part 3, just say continue part 3. Part 3 The woman who smiled at death. Hook. Sometimes evil does not shout. Sometimes it moves quietly, like a shadow passing behind a door. And sometimes it grows in plain sight, hidden inside a smile you never question, until it is too late. The winter of 1863 felt heavier than any before it. Cold wind moved across the Ashley River plantation, shaking the old oak trees and rattling the windows of the field hospital. The war was going badly for the Confederacy, and the dying seemed endless. No one questioned the high numbers anymore. Men arrived bleeding, coughing, shaking with fever. They died fast. They died slow. They died in ways that looked natural, and everyone accepted it because the war had made death look ordinary. But something else lived inside that hospital. Something silent. Something patient. The woman from Beaufort moved through the sick rooms with calm steps. She carried jars of herbs, folded cloths, and small bottles of mixed plants she never explained. She spoke little. She watched everything. Her eyes followed every officer who came in with wounds that should have healed, but somehow never did. She had spent more than a year perfecting something deadly. A method. A quiet science. She used plants that grew easily in the low country. Oleander that made the heart tremble. Water hemlock that twisted the nerves. Pokeweed that ruined the stomach from the inside. When mixed just right, each one looked like a natural illness. A fever. A sudden infection. A complication from a battlefield wound. Even if someone had suspected poison, they would never have been able to prove it. There was no test, no equipment, no knowledge, no reason to think someone like her could possibly create so much destruction without firing a single shot. But she did, and she waited for her chance to do more. The season changed. Winter turned harsh. January and February came with cold rains. Inside the plantation house, something unexpected happened. Colonel Haverford, the proud owner of the property and the man who believed he controlled everything with his authority, fell sick. Not from poison, not from the woman, but from his own failing liver. Years of illness finally caught up with him, and he passed through the rooms pale and weak until he could no longer leave his bed. When he died, the plantation changed hands. Control passed to his wife, Eleanor Haverford, a woman who had always kept herself at a polite distance from the hospital. She trusted her husband's systems. She trusted his judgment, and she trusted the woman from Beaufort because everyone else did. In March 1864, Mrs. Haverford's son returned home. Lieutenant Charles Haverford, young, confident, full of life, carrying only a small wound on his arm. Nothing serious, nothing life-threatening, something that should have healed quickly. It did not. 2 days after he arrived, he developed a strange fever. It rose and fell in ways Drive. Bellingham could not explain. The woman from Beaufort stayed by his bed constantly, preparing teas, mixing medicines, touching his forehead with cool rags. Mrs. Haverford watched closely, though she said nothing. She wanted to believe her son was in good hands. She wanted to trust the system her husband had left behind. But the fever grew worse. Charles became weaker. His skin lost its color. His eyes sank deeper each day. And the woman from Beaufort stayed close, always calm, always offering the next cup of tea. On the 7th night, something happened that changed everything. Charles woke in a fever dream. His mind was hot and confused. Sweat covered his skin. His heart raced. When the woman leaned forward to give him another drink, he grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. He whispered, with fear in his voice, "You are killing me, are you not? Like you killed the others." The room froze. She did not answer. She did not deny it. She did not pull her hand away. She only looked at him with her still, quiet eyes. And that silence told the truth. Mrs. Haverford sat in the corner of the room. She had not been seen. But she saw everything. The look in the woman's eyes. The way she showed no surprise. And worst of all, the faint shine of satisfaction that crossed her face when Charles's grip weakened. That moment cracked something inside Eleanor Haverford. Suddenly she remembered every unexplained death. Every strange illness. Every story Drive. Bellingham had brushed off. She saw the pattern. Her husband had been too proud to notice. She removed the woman from her son's bedside that very night. Under Drive, Bellingham's full supervision, Charles recovered within days. Now Mrs. Haverford knew. She knew the woman was dangerous. She knew something terrible had happened inside her plantation. And she knew she had to see the truth with her own eyes. For 2 weeks she locked herself in her husband's old office and studied the hospital records. Every name, every injury, every death. Her husband had always been organized. His notes were detailed and complete. When she finished the numbers, the truth made her hands shake. 143 soldiers had been treated at the plantation hospital in the past 16 months. 94 of them had died. That was 65.7%. High, but possible in wartime. What was not possible was the pattern behind those numbers. Officers died at 78%. Wealthy young soldiers died at 71%. Educated men died at 69%. Poor farmers and laborers died at 34%. The woman had not been killing at random. She had been killing with purpose. She was targeting the Confederacy's leadership class. She was allowing the poorest conscripted men to survive and return home. Mrs. Haverford confronted Drive Bellingham with the records. At first he defended his decisions. Officers had worse wounds. Wealthy men were softer. It all made sense to him. But when Mrs. Haverford pointed out the men with only scratches who had died suddenly, the fevers that came from nowhere, the changes in medicine that he never approved, he began to crumble. He realized he had trusted the woman completely. He realized he had allowed her to kill under his roof. He realized he had helped her without knowing. The knowledge broke him. Dr. Bellingham wanted to call the authorities immediately. But something stopped him. The law offered no justice. An enslaved woman was not a citizen. She was property. Legally she could not commit murder. She could only damage other property. It was a darkness neither of them had fully understood until that moment. Mrs. Haverford faced her own nightmare. If people learned the truth, the family reputation would be destroyed. The plantation would be taken. Her children would be shamed. Everything her husband had built would collapse. The consequences were too great. So she made a decision. She closed the hospital. She forced Drive Bellingham to resign. She arranged for the woman from Beaufort to be sold far away, with no record of her medical knowledge. On the morning the woman learned she was leaving, she showed no emotion. She packed her things and waited quietly. When she left, she never looked at the main house. She only looked once at the graveyard behind it. Some said she smiled, but the story did not end there. Because during those 16 months, she had not only killed. She had studied. She had learned. She had quietly turned Haverford Plantation into her own secret school, preparing for something much larger than anyone imagined. And Part 4 would reveal what that truly meant. If you want, I can continue with Part 4 in the same style. Part 4: The Road Out of Beaufort. Hook. Evil does not disappear when you send it away. Sometimes it grows stronger when it is forced into darkness. Sometimes the most dangerous monster is the one you think you have buried. The woman from Beaufort sat in the back of Jasper Crenshaw's wagon with iron chains around her wrists. The morning sun pushed through the trees, turning the long road into stripes of golden shadow. She did not speak. She did not fight. She only watched the road ahead, calm as river water, while the wheels rolled through mud and fallen leaves. Mrs. Eleanor Haverford watched from the porch. Her hands trembled as she held the railing. She felt relief. She felt fear, but she also felt something she did not want to admit. She felt the cold presence of something unfinished. Something waiting. The wagon disappeared into the trees. But the story did not. Inside the plantation house, Eleanor burned the final copy of the hospital records she had altered. The numbers that told the truth were hidden away in a small locked drawer. No one would ever look at them again. No one could ever know that almost 100 soldiers had died under her roof. She tried to calm her breathing. She told herself it was over. It was not. The woman from Beaufort kept her eyes ahead as the wagon moved north toward Columbia. The other enslaved people being transported sat quietly around her, terrified of the traitor. Some had been sold for fighting back. Others for refusing work. Others simply because their owners needed money. But she was different. They sensed it. They kept distance from her without understanding why. She sat straight. Her face had no fear. Her silence felt powerful, like something measured and controlled. Even the traitor, Jasper Crenshaw, kept glancing over his shoulder at her as if he felt something he could not name. After 2 hours, he finally spoke. "You are a quiet one. That makes things easier." She did not respond. He tried again. "You will like Tennessee more. Fewer officers. Fewer fancy soldiers. Just hard land and harder people." Still no answer. He shrugged and clicked the reins. The horses moved faster. But Jasper did not know he was carrying someone who had learned secrets no one else possessed. She had spent 16 months learning Confederate medical systems, military patterns, supply chains, and communication flaws. She had learned the weaknesses of officers, the structure of field hospitals, the hidden errors in reports, and the way deaths could disappear inside chaotic paperwork. She had turned war into a science. A quiet science. And she had not finished. As they continued the journey, night began to fall. The trees turned darker. Crickets began to sing. A storm gathered in the distance. The air thickened and smelled like rain. Jasper pulled the wagon to the side of the road and set up a small camp under an old cypress tree. He fed the horses, then tied every enslaved person to the wagon wheels before resting by the fire. But he chained the woman from Beaufort separately. He felt something dangerous in her calm face, something that made him uneasy. He placed her against a tree trunk and used double iron locks for her wrists. "Just in case," he muttered. She watched him quietly. When he stepped away, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The scent of the forest. The coming rain. The night insects. She was listening. Listening for something far away. Listening the same way she had listened every night in the hospital when soldiers moaned in pain and officers whispered in their sleep. Listening for weakness. Lightning flashed once in the distance. A long roll of thunder followed. The storm arrived fast. Rain poured down in sheets, slapping the leaves and hitting the ground like fists. Jasper cursed and ran to cover the fire. The horses panicked. The wagon shook. The other enslaved people cried out as the cold water hit their faces. But the woman from Beaufort did not move. She let the rain wash over her, running down her face, soaking her dress, cooling her skin. Something about the storm steadied her. She looked up into the black sky as if the darkness belonged to her. Jasper shouted orders. He tried to move the wagon to better ground, but the wheels sank deeper into the mud. He pulled on the horses. They reared and screamed. The storm raged harder, and in the chaos he forgot one important thing. He forgot to check the chains. Rain had loosened the earth around the tree roots. The metal had pulled slightly. The woman twisted her wrists, slow and steady. She knew the shape of iron. She knew how metal changed under cold rain. She knew how to work a lock without tools. She had learned from watching soldiers fix their equipment. She had studied everything without ever revealing her intentions. Within a few minutes, her wrists slipped free. But she did not run. She waited. The storm grew worse. The trees swayed like skeletons. Thunder cracked across the sky. One of the horses broke loose, dragging a rope through the mud, screaming with fear. Jasper chased after it, slipping in the wet ground. The horse bolted into the woods. He was alone. The woman from Beaufort opened her eyes fully. They were calm, too calm. She stood up quietly and walked toward the wagon where the other enslaved people sat chained and shivering. One man whispered, "Are you escaping? Help us." She looked at him with expressionless eyes. "No," she said softly. "Escape is not my purpose." He shivered. Not from the cold, from her voice. She walked past him, past the wagon, past the horse's empty traces. She moved toward Jasper Crenshaw, who was still fighting the mud and the terrified horse. The storm suddenly fell silent. Jasper looked up. The woman stood a few feet away, unmoving, watching him. Something inside him twisted with fear. He took a step back. Then another. Rain dripped from his hat. The dark sky crackled above them. "Get back," he warned, though his voice shook. She stepped toward him slowly. There was no anger in her face. Only purpose. A cold purpose. The storm lit up the sky with a blast of lightning, revealing everything in a single white flash. By the time the thunder rolled, Jasper Crenshaw was gone. The woman from Beaufort returned to the wagon slowly, her dress soaking wet and her face calm again. The others stared at her with wide eyes. None dared to speak. She sat down near the tree roots and waited for the storm to pass. When dawn arrived, she was the only person in the camp who appeared untouched by the night. The horses were gone, Jasper Crenshaw was gone, and she was free. But she did not run. She had a plan, a larger plan. The Confederacy had taken everything from her. Now she knew how to take everything from them. Part 5 would reveal her next move. If you want, I can continue with Part 5 in the same dark, simple, cinematic style. Part 5 The Ghost of Tennessee. Hook. Some people leave a place behind. Others leave a trail of shadows. And some, like her, become a ghost that men will remember long after they are dead. The woman from Beaufort arrived in Tennessee without a name, without a past, without anyone to notice her. She walked through small towns with her head down, moving among farmers and laborers who did not question the presence of a quiet, pale woman traveling alone. She had learned to move like the wind, to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Every detail of her journey mattered. Every inn, every market, every road, every stranger she passed was recorded in her memory. She observed how people spoke, how they moved, and how they responded to authority. She learned their routines, their fears, their weaknesses. And she smiled quietly to herself because she knew she would use that knowledge. Tennessee was different from the lowcountry. The hills rose sharply from the valleys. Rivers cut deep gorges, and the forests were thick with pine and oak. It was a place that could hide someone who wanted to remain unseen. It was also a place where Confederate soldiers had fled after skirmishes, wounded and forgotten. Her first stop was a small cabin on the outskirts of Greene County. She offered to work as a nurse for anyone who needed help. Word traveled fast in these rural areas. Soldiers returning from the front, men with minor injuries and fevers, came to see her. But she did not treat them all equally. She remembered every lesson from Haverford. She remembered how to study a man in silence. She remembered how to recognize the strong and the weak, the clever and the arrogant. She began choosing her patients carefully. Officers, educated men, those who had lived in comfort and privilege, they would feel her care and then their strength would drain away. The poor farmers and conscripts, the men who fought because they had no choice, they would recover under her hands. They would go home, to fight another day, to tell the stories of survival without knowing the reason behind it. She was patient. She was precise. Each death had to feel natural. A fever, a sudden infection, a heart failure. No one questioned it. No one connected the patterns. One man, a young lieutenant from Georgia, came to her cabin with a small wound on his side. He carried himself like he owned the world. The moment he saw her, he sneered at her quiet manners. "Are you even a trained nurse?" he asked. She did not answer. She smiled faintly. That small smile told him nothing and everything at once. She treated him gently. She mixed teas from herbs she had carried from South Carolina. She applied poultices to his wound. She whispered soft words that made him feel calm and safe. He died 3 days later. His death was ruled typhoid, though his wound was minor. No one suspected anything. Another soldier, an older man who had served as a sergeant, arrived with a broken arm. He was rough, used to hardship, and suspicious by nature. He watched her carefully, asked questions about her methods, and refused her teas. He left alive, thankful for the splints she provided and unaware of what he had dodged. By the end of the first month, her pattern was clear. Only the undeserving, only those she had chosen, would die. The others would survive. Her reputation began to grow quietly. People spoke of the woman who could heal the sick, who could save men from death when no one else could. Farmers whispered her name without knowing it. Soldiers passed tales of her skill from one regiment to another. The legend grew, though it was not yet written in newspapers or official records. But she did not care for fame. She cared for knowledge and preparation. Tennessee would be her new classroom. Every injury, every fever, every death would teach her something new. She began keeping her own records, simple notes on scraps of paper she hid under floorboards and in hollowed trees. She tracked who died, who lived, and why. She observed soldiers as they slept, as they whispered to each other, as they boasted of bravery and courage. She studied their weaknesses. She learned which herbs caused fevers, which caused heart irregularities, which could mimic infections. She practiced subtlety, ensuring no one suspected her hand. She also studied the land, the rivers, the hills, the forests. She mapped paths for escape, hiding places for herself and for others if needed. She learned to hunt, to move silently, to survive in any weather. She understood that war was not only in the battlefields but also in the spaces between. Word of a strange woman spread to nearby towns. Some called her an angel. Others whispered that she was a ghost. She did not correct them. Ghosts moved silently and were remembered longer than living people. In May 1864, a small group of Confederate soldiers arrived at her cabin. They were officers, arrogant, complaining about minor wounds and the hardship of war. She welcomed them, smiled at them, and treated them with the care they expected. But inside, she measured them. She studied their habits, their speech, their pride. By the third night, one officer began to complain of severe chest pains. She gave him a warm drink and left the cabin briefly. When she returned, his pulse was irregular. She adjusted the herbs again, carefully, silently. By morning, he had passed away. Death seemed natural. No one questioned it. Her method continued through the summer. She became known across Greene County as a woman who could save soldiers, and yet soldiers continued to die quietly in her care. Her system was working perfectly. She had become a specter of vengeance, a quiet terror for those who had caused so much suffering. And yet she did not celebrate. She did not boast. She only planned, because she knew the war would continue. She knew more soldiers would come. She knew more officers would arrive with arrogance in their eyes and pride in their hearts. She would be ready. By the end of the summer of 1864, she had transformed her cabin into a field hospital of her own design. She had organized supplies, herbs, simple surgical tools, and a small network of local people who trusted her without knowing why. She was no longer the woman from Beaufort. She was something more. She was the ghost of Tennessee. And the Confederacy would never see it coming. If you want, I can continue with Part 6, where the ghost begins systematic influence over Confederate officers, increasing the suspense and horror, still keeping it historically grounded and gripping for your YouTube audience. Do you want me to continue with Part 6 next? Part 6: The Ghost Moves. Hook. Some ghosts haunt the living with screams. Others haunt them with silence. And the woman from Beaufort learned that silence can be the deadliest weapon of all. By the fall of 1864, the woman from Beaufort had made herself invisible in plain sight. Locals whispered of her skill and calm presence, yet no one suspected the truth. Soldiers arrived at her cabin, seeking care. She treated them all, but she chose her victims with the precision of a surgeon. Officers with pride and arrogance, men who had hurt others or carried themselves as though their lives were above consequence, they were the first to feel her touch. The common soldiers, the young men dragged into the war by draft or circumstance, survived. They left her cabin and returned to their families, unaware of the invisible hand that spared them. Her knowledge had grown beyond herbs and fevers. She had learned to read the human body with uncanny accuracy. A faint flush on the skin, a subtle shift in breathing, the way a man's pulse faltered when he saw her eyes, all became tools. She could decide in an instant who would live and who would die, and she did so with careful consideration. One evening, a group of 3 officers arrived from a nearby regiment. They were loud, confident, and careless. They had no respect for the people they commanded. They demanded treatment immediately, ignoring local customs, their boots muddy and uniforms stained. She welcomed them inside. She mixed a healing poultice for a gunshot wound, applied herbal compresses to a sprained ankle, and gave warm tea to soothe their fevers. She moved slowly, methodically, observing. She noted the rhythm of their voices, the way their eyes darted around the cabin. Each detail mattered. By the third day, one officer began complaining of dizziness. She smiled faintly and adjusted his tea, whispering words that sounded like kindness but contained instructions only she understood. His pulse weakened by the next morning. Another officer fell ill with stomach cramps that no one could explain. Within a week, one officer was dead, and the others were weakened. She was not careless. Every death seemed natural. Illnesses that mimicked infection or disease made her work undetectable. No one questioned the patterns because no one expected a woman, an enslaved person, to wield such calculated power. The surrounding towns began speaking of the woman from Beaufort with a mixture of fear and admiration. Some called her a healer. Some whispered she was a witch. But no one dared to ask her directly. Those who tried received only a calm, unreadable look. By winter, she had expanded her influence. Soldiers came not only from Greene County but from neighboring towns and counties. Each time an officer arrived, she studied him. She learned about their families, their habits, their arrogance, their weaknesses. Every death was a lesson. Every survival was carefully measured. She began to leave subtle clues about herself in her records, hidden in herbs, in measurements, in handwritten notes in Latin or obscure plant names. If anyone ever looked for patterns, they would have difficulty tracing her hand. It was not just murder. It was art. One night, a Confederate major arrived, wounded and demanding immediate care. He sneered at her calm demeanor and insisted he knew better than she did. She did not argue. She treated him with the same precision she had always used. But she studied him more closely. She noted his heart rate, his breathing, the subtle tremor in his hand. By the second night, he became weak, confused, and feverish. His cries echoed through the cabin, but she remained calm, adjusting his treatment just slightly to ensure his death appeared natural. By dawn, he was gone. The surviving officers began to whisper among themselves. They noticed the strange coincidences, the deaths of men who should have recovered. Yet no one could accuse her. How could they? She was just a woman. She was a healer. She was invisible in a world where her existence had no official weight. Even Confederate authorities could not intervene. They were too busy with the collapsing front lines, the constant flow of casualties, and the confusion of war. By the time they might have noticed patterns, the woman had moved on to new targets, new towns, new soldiers. Her network of knowledge grew. She began to memorize the movements of regiments, the paths of supply wagons, the patterns of communication between officers. She saw weakness where others saw obedience. She studied arrogance and discovered its predictable outcomes. And she began to plan. By the spring of 1865, she was no longer confined to her cabin. She traveled with purpose. She went to regimental camps, small hospitals, and temporary field facilities. Everywhere she went, she observed, studied, and acted. She treated the wounded. She listened to their conversations. She cataloged their strengths and weaknesses. She collected information silently while shaping their fates. Her actions were precise. She avoided suspicion. Every death looked like a natural result of war. Every survival appeared miraculous. She also began to inspire fear in whispers. Soldiers spoke of a woman who could see into their minds, who could heal and kill with equal ease. Officers became wary, but no one could prove her hand. By then, her reputation had grown beyond the towns she directly visited. Tales of the Beaufort ghost spread through the Southern ranks. Yet she never revealed her true intent. She did not seek glory. She did not seek revenge in the way others might have. She sought justice in a form shaped by her knowledge, her experience, and the cruelty she had endured. Every officer who had contributed to the suffering of others, every man whose pride caused death and misery, was a target. Every soldier who had been dragged into war unwillingly, every man who fought because he had no choice, was spared. Her methods were silent. They were invisible. They were perfect. And by the end of that year, she had changed the lives of dozens of soldiers without ever being discovered. No one could understand the pattern. No one could explain the deaths. No one questioned her authority. She had become untouchable. She was more than a woman. She was a shadow of vengeance. She was the ghost of Tennessee. And the war was ending, but her work was far from over. Part 7 will reveal how she expands her influence across multiple states, striking fear into those who once thought themselves untouchable, building her legend as both healer and executioner. Do you want me to continue with Part 7 next? Part 7 The Ghost Expands. Hook. She had become a whisper in the South. A shadow moving unseen. But shadows can stretch, and hers was about to grow longer than anyone could imagine. By the summer of 1865, The woman from Beaufort had become more than a local legend. Word of her strange abilities spread through whispered stories carried by soldiers and travelers alike. Some said she could heal the gravest wounds. Others claimed men died under her care for reasons no one could understand. Officers spoke cautiously when her name arose. The common soldiers, those who survived her attention, returned home with nervous gratitude, too young or inexperienced to question how close death had really come. She moved with careful purpose. Tennessee had taught her many lessons, but it had also shown her the limits of hiding. She realized that if she wanted to truly shape the fates of those who had caused suffering, she would need to travel further. Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina. The war had left the South fragmented, cities emptying, hospitals full of despair. She could move freely, taking advantage of the chaos. Her path was calculated. She did not rush. Every stop, every cabin, every temporary field hospital was studied before she arrived. She learned the habits of local officers, the weaknesses of medical staff, and the rhythm of the wounded men she treated. No death was wasted. Every patient, every result, became a lesson in precision. In a small town near the border of Virginia, she set up a temporary station in a farmhouse abandoned by its owners. Soldiers arrived wounded from skirmishes along the railroads. Officers with arrogance came seeking care first. They were her priority. The poor men, conscripted from fields and factories, came later, and they were spared. She healed them fully, sending them home with whispered advice and subtle warnings about survival. A captain named Silas Montgomery arrived one evening, wounded from a gunshot to his shoulder. He carried himself like royalty, convinced that his rank gave him immunity. He demanded immediate attention, barking orders at anyone in the farmhouse. She welcomed him, tended to his wound with precision, and spoke softly, never raising her voice. Montgomery did not notice the careful adjustments she made to his teas, the subtle shifts in the poultices, or the slow changes in his medications. Within 3 nights, his fever rose, his pulse weakened, and his sleep became fitful. By dawn on the 4th day, he was gone. His death was ruled a complication from the wound. No one questioned it. As she traveled, she began to notice patterns among the officers. Some were cruel by nature, their arrogance earned through wealth or education. Others were careless, underestimating those they commanded. She catalogued their traits, taking mental notes. She began to anticipate behavior before it happened, knowing which men would be resistant and which would comply without question. She moved like a ghost through the South. Soldiers whispered about a pale, silent woman who appeared at the bedside of the wounded and left only with the echo of her presence. Some claimed she could sense guilt or cowardice in a man and that those feelings marked him for death. Others said she had an aura of calm that made even the most stubborn officer comply with her guidance. Her fame was spreading, but she remained unseen. She avoided towns when possible, never staying in the same place for more than a few weeks. She learned to use the land to her advantage. Forests, rivers, hills, and abandoned homesteads became her classrooms, her hospitals, and her hiding places. In Virginia, she encountered a group of Confederate officers recovering from a failed raid. They had expected to rest, to be healed, and to return to the front. Instead, they found her quiet gaze assessing them as if she could see every fault, every weakness, every secret. Lieutenant Henry Caldwell, a man of wealth and influence, noticed her lingering over one of his peers, a minor officer, before moving on to him. He dismissed it at first, thinking she was simply efficient. But by the 3rd day, the minor officer had fallen ill under her care, and Caldwell began to watch her closely. He followed her movements, observing how she adjusted medicines, prepared poultices, and administered teas. He saw her making minute changes that no one could notice unless they were paying the closest attention. Caldwell began to suspect, but he could not act. He could not accuse her openly. How could he prove a woman had the ability to selectively kill men under her care, especially when every death seemed natural? By the time Caldwell left the farmhouse, several officers had died. Those who survived carried whispers of her skill and fear. Caldwell himself returned to his regiment with a quiet unease, knowing he had witnessed something he could never explain. She did not rest. Each town, each battlefield, Each temporary hospital was an opportunity. She studied human nature, military hierarchy, and medicine in ways no one else could. She understood bureaucracy, how reports were filed, how deaths were recorded, and she used it to her advantage. No official noticed that the deaths of certain officers were unusually high. The war had created too much chaos, too much noise. Her reach grew. Soldiers spoke of her quietly, their voices hushed. They called her the Ghost of Tennessee, the Shadow Healer, or simply the woman who decided who lived and who died. No one knew her name. No one knew her story. But everyone who crossed her path felt her presence in a way that lingered long after she was gone. By the end of the year, her system had expanded across 3 states. She had learned to read human behavior almost as well as she read the body. She had perfected the art of subtle influence, ensuring deaths looked natural and survivals appeared miraculous. She had turned her knowledge, her skill, and her pain into a weapon more powerful than any rifle or cannon. And she had no intention of stopping. Because the war was ending, but she had a mission that stretched beyond battlefields. Her war was just beginning. Part 8 will reveal how she begins to manipulate her environment on a larger scale, using fear and rumor as tools, and solidifying her legend as both ghost and executioner. Do you want me to continue with Part 8 next? Part 8 The Ghost's Shadow. Hook. She was no longer just a healer, no longer just a killer. She had become something else entirely. A force moving unseen, a shadow spreading fear, and the South would never forget her name. By early 1866, rumors of the woman from Beaufort had spread like wildfire across the southern states. Soldiers who had survived her care whispered of her uncanny ability to heal and harm in equal measure. Stories of her precision, her calm demeanor, and her subtle power reached years far beyond the farms and cabins she visited. Yet no one could track her, no one could prove anything, and most were too afraid to try. She had learned much in the past year. Not only about human anatomy and the medicines she could manipulate, but about the fears, pride, and secrets of the men she encountered. She had learned how to bend perception, how to plant ideas, how to make men question themselves. The fear she inspired was invisible but pervasive. Officers began to look over their shoulders, whispering warnings to one another, but they had no proof and no defense. Her operations expanded. She no longer confined herself to temporary hospitals or small cabins. She moved into towns under the guise of a traveling healer. Markets, churches, and even plantation estates became part of her network. She offered aid openly, earning trust and admiration, while subtly assessing each man who crossed her path. Those who carried cruelty in their hearts or pride in their step were quietly marked. In a small Virginia town, she encountered Major Silas Redford, a man notorious for brutal treatment of prisoners. Redford sneered at her calm manner and the rumors that surrounded her. He believed his wealth and rank made him untouchable. He did not realize she had already observed him for hours, cataloging his habits, his mannerisms, even the subtle tension in his hands when he thought no one was watching. The first night Redford spent under her care, she treated a minor wound he had suffered in a skirmish. Her hands were steady, her words soothing, but she made slight adjustments to his ointments and teas. By dawn, he awoke feeling weak, confused, his body betraying him in ways he could not understand. Redford blamed the fever and exhaustion, unaware of the carefully crafted poisons she had blended from local plants. Word of Redford's sudden illness spread, but it was chalked up to the hardships of war and the lingering effects of battlefield injuries. No one suspected the woman from Beaufort. By the end of the week, Redford was dead, his passing quietly noted in the local papers as the result of a lingering infection. Her pattern became clearer with each new encounter. Officers who had caused suffering or wielded power cruelly did not survive her care. Those who were conscripted, humble, or unaware of their own arrogance were spared. Death appeared random, yet it was precise. Her victims never suspected until it was too late. The woman also began to understand the power of rumor. She allowed stories of her abilities to circulate, knowing that fear alone could influence behavior. Soldiers whispered about her as though she were a phantom. Some claimed she could foresee death, others that she could manipulate the body without touching it. The tales grew, becoming legends that preceded her arrival. She used the fear she inspired to her advantage. Officers became cautious, hesitant, and second-guessed their actions. Their pride faltered, their confidence weakened. She did not need to harm them directly every time. The psychological impact of her reputation became a weapon as deadly as any poison. In a town near the border of North Carolina, she encountered a group of 3 officers traveling together. They had heard the whispers but believed themselves immune. They were arrogant, careless, and dismissive of the local population. She welcomed them into her care, observing closely as she treated minor wounds and fevers. Within 3 days, one officer fell gravely ill under her watch, another developed sudden paralysis, and the third began showing symptoms of cardiac distress. Panic spread among them, yet she remained calm, speaking softly, offering comfort, hiding the deadly precision of her interventions. By the end of the week, all 3 were dead, their deaths officially recorded as complications from injuries. The townspeople noticed the pattern but feared speaking openly. A shadow had fallen across the region, and it carried her name. Soldiers avoided her presence when possible, whispering to one another about the ghost of Beaufort. Those who survived her care returned home with tales of a woman who could heal and kill, who could see into the hearts of men, who carried justice in her hands. Her network of influence grew. She moved freely across state lines, guided by her understanding of war, medicine, and human behavior. She learned how to navigate towns without arousing suspicion, how to gain trust while maintaining secrecy, and how to make deaths appear natural. Every move was calculated, every encounter studied, every outcome controlled. By winter of 1866, the woman had expanded her reach across Tennessee, Virginia, and the Carolinas. She had become a ghost that moved silently, leaving behind only whispers and questions. Soldiers spoke of her in hushed tones, officers feared her unseen judgment, and common men marveled at her miraculous care. Yet she did not rest. Each encounter taught her something new. She learned to exploit social hierarchies, to identify pride and cruelty, to anticipate behavior. She honed her ability to manipulate medicine, using local plants and subtle techniques to influence the outcomes of those under her care. She had become more than a healer. She had become an executioner, a teacher, and a shadow. Her legend grew with every passing town, every whispered story, and every officer who never returned home. And the South, still reeling from the war and struggling to rebuild, could not touch her. They did not understand her, and they could not catch her. She was untouchable, unstoppable, and invisible in a world that had never recognized her true power. The ghost of Beaufort was no longer just a woman. She was an idea, a force, a shadow that stretched across states, shaping the fates of men who thought themselves untouchable. Her story was far from over. Part 9 will explore how she returns to North Carolina, confronts old enemies, and sets the stage for the terrifying night when the Klansmen finally encounter the ghost in the tobacco barn. Do you want me to continue with Part 9 next? Part 9 Return to Greensboro. Hook. She had haunted the South for years, a shadow moving unseen, her victims numbering in the dozens. But the night of reckoning was coming. And this time, she would not wait for fate to decide. She would take it into her own hands. After years of moving through Tennessee, Virginia, and the Carolinas, the woman from Beaufort returned to North Carolina in the fall of 1871. The war was over, but its echoes remained. Soldiers still carried the pride of their rank, officers still clung to their titles, and the ghosts of the past haunted plantations, towns, and field hospitals alike. Greensboro had grown since the war, but it had not changed its attitudes. Wealthy men still wielded power, secret societies still enforced order, and the wounds of conflict still festered beneath polite society. She moved quietly, aware that the eyes of those who had once survived her care might now be searching for her. She had waited years for this moment. Her destination was not random. She had tracked 3 men for nearly a decade, Confederate officers she had once seen bleed and die in a field hospital in South Carolina. Fate had brought them back into her path, and she would meet them on her terms. They were now part of a local organization, robed and secretive, enforcing control in the shadows. They thought they could intimidate her, silence the rumors, and protect their reputations. They were wrong. On the night of October 14, 1871, 40 white-robed figures surrounded her in a tobacco barn outside Greensboro. The moon cast long shadows across the wooden beams, and the smell of cured leaves hung thick in the air. They expected fear, submission, and perhaps a plea for mercy. They had no idea what was coming. She recognized 3 of them immediately. The same officers she had watched die nearly a decade before now stood before her, their postures unchanged, their arrogance intact. But she had changed. She had grown stronger, wiser, and more patient. She was no longer a woman to be underestimated. They stepped forward, chanting their secret words, attempting to summon authority over her. She smiled, not out of kindness, not out of amusement, but because she knew the truth. She had waited, studied, and prepared. She had anticipated their arrival and knew precisely how to confront them. The first officer lunged, trying to seize her. She sidestepped, swift and silent, and he fell to the ground with no visible cause. The second officer reached for a hidden weapon, but his hands froze mid-motion. The third tried to shout a warning, but the words caught in his throat, and he collapsed, clutching his chest. The remaining men hesitated, fear spreading like wildfire. They had expected a woman, perhaps an old slave, perhaps someone to intimidate or frighten. They had not expected the predator they now faced. She moved through the barn with precision. Each step, each glance, each word was measured. She invoked no magic, no spell, only her presence and the knowledge she had cultivated for years. Fear itself became her ally. By the time the last man realized what was happening, 3 were dead, others incapacitated, and the rest had fled into the night. Those who survived carried her reputation with them, stories of a ghostly woman who could kill without touching, who could predict and manipulate, and who had returned to exact justice on those who had once oppressed her. After the encounter, she remained in Greensboro, but her purpose had shifted. She was no longer merely a healer, a killer, or a ghost. She had become a guardian of memory, a living reminder of the horrors of war, slavery, and unchecked power. Her victims were officers, men of arrogance and cruelty, yet she spared the innocent, the conscripted, and those who posed no threat. The local authorities buried the incident deep, recording nothing more than a routine property inspection. But those who were there, those who saw her in motion, whispered of the ghost of Greensboro. They told of the smile that crossed her face when she recognized her former targets, the calm that preceded chaos, and the methodical precision that left no evidence behind. Her work was far from finished. The patterns she had established over a decade, studying human nature, manipulating medicine, wielding fear as a weapon, would guide her in years to come. She had proven that power was not limited to armies or titles, but could be claimed by those with knowledge, patience, and courage. As the sun rose over Greensboro the next morning, the barn stood silent. No trace remained of the chaos from the night before, except for the lingering memory in the minds of those who had witnessed it. She had left her mark, but she left no trail. She was a ghost in the truest sense, a force to be reckoned with yet untouchable, a symbol of vengeance, intelligence, and resilience. And the South would remember her, not in official records, not in history books, but in whispers, stories, and the deep, unspoken fear that justice could be swift, unseen, and inevitable. The woman from Beaufort, the ghost of Greensboro, had returned to claim her past, confront her enemies, and prove that even in a world stacked against her, she could not only survive, but control fate itself. Her legend would live long after the men she confronted, spreading beyond the towns, beyond the plantations, into the very fabric of the region. Fear, respect, and awe followed her name. She was no longer just a story. She was history. And the final chapter was yet to come. Part 10 will be the final, thrilling conclusion, revealing the full legacy of the ghost of Greensboro and her ultimate impact on those who survived and those who had never seen her coming. Do you want me to continue with Part 10 next? Part 10: The Legacy of the Ghost. Hook. The night was cold, the moon hidden behind heavy clouds. 40 men in white robes thought they could confront her, control her, or silence her. They were wrong. They didn't understand that the ghost of Greensboro had been waiting for them all along. The tobacco barn outside Greensboro was silent except for the rustle of dry leaves against the wooden walls. The air was thick with tension, and the men inside had no idea that the woman they had come to intimidate was not just prepared, she had predicted every move they would make. She stood in the center, her calm presence unnerving. Her eyes scanned each figure, noting who would flee, who would falter, and who might resist. The three officers she recognized stepped forward with false confidence, believing their past victories and positions gave them authority. But authority meant nothing to her. She had studied them, understood them, and now the reckoning had come. The first officer advanced, trying to assert dominance, but she sidestepped effortlessly. His foot caught on a beam, and he stumbled. Her movements were precise, controlled, and terrifyingly quiet. She didn't need weapons, she needed only her presence and the fear she had cultivated over years of patience and planning. One by one, the men realized they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Panic spread, breaking their carefully rehearsed rituals and chants. The barn seemed to close in on them. Shadows danced along the walls, distorted by the faint flicker of lantern light. Every breath they took was heavy with dread. She moved among them, her hands calm and deliberate. Every gesture carried authority, every glance measured. Some men collapsed, overwhelmed by the sudden terror. Others tried to escape, only to be blocked by the sheer inevitability of her presence. She was in every corner, yet nowhere at all, like a shadow that refused to be caught. The three officers she had once watched bleed in a field hospital could not hide from the truth. They saw the pattern, recognized it instantly, and for the first time, felt powerless. The ghost of Greensboro was not a figment of rumor or imagination. She was real, and she had returned to finish what she had started years ago. By the end of the night, the barn was empty except for her. Those who had survived fled with stories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They spoke of a woman who could heal and kill, who could manipulate life and death, and who carried justice in her hands. Her smile had been the last thing they saw, a chilling reminder that they had underestimated her. After the confrontation, she disappeared once again into the night. She moved quietly through towns and plantations, leaving behind whispers and fear. But she also left something else, a legacy of resistance, courage, and intelligence. She had taken the tools of her oppressors, knowledge of medicine, understanding of human behavior, and patience, and turned them into instruments of justice. Her actions challenged everything the South believed about power, race, and survival. She had operated in a world stacked against her. Yet she had not only survived, she had controlled the outcomes. Officers who once ruled with cruelty had fallen, while the innocent had been spared. Her sense of justice was methodical, deliberate, and relentless. Stories of the ghost of Greensboro spread far and wide, carried by those who had survived her care or encountered her legend. Some claimed to see her in the shadows, walking silently across fields, disappearing into the night before anyone could approach. Others swore they felt her presence in hospitals or homes, a silent reminder that her work had not ended. Her legend became part of the fabric of the South's hidden history. Official records said nothing of her deeds, yet whispers persisted in towns, plantations, and fields. Children were told stories of a woman who could see the truth in hearts, who punished cruelty, and protected the powerless. The ghost of Greensboro became more than a name. She became an idea, a symbol of justice, intellect, and fear that could not be ignored. Even years later, people would look back on that night in the tobacco barn and wonder how 40 men could have been so wrong, how they could have believed they could intimidate or control a single woman. The answer was simple: they had underestimated her. They had failed to see that power does not always come from wealth, rank, or weapons. True power comes from knowledge, patience, and the courage to act. The ghost of Greensboro was gone from sight, but not from memory. Every officer she had confronted, every man she had spared, carried a fragment of her story. And though history books would rarely mention her, the truth survived in whispers, in legends, and in the fear that she could return at any moment. She had done more than punish. She had taught a lesson that echoed through generations. Those who abuse power may think themselves untouchable, but the world has a way of balancing the scales, even if it takes years to do so. Her name, though erased from official records, would live on wherever courage, intellect, and justice intersected. And so, the woman from before, The ghost of Greensboro faded into history, but her presence lingered. In the quiet corners of old plantations, in abandoned field hospitals, in stories shared by those who remembered, she remained. Not as a shadow to fear, but as a force to respect, a reminder that one person, armed with knowledge and patience, could change the course of lives and rewrite what history chose to ignore. If you enjoyed this story of the ghost of Greensboro and want to uncover more hidden chapters of American history, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Share this story with your friends and family, and tell us in the comments what state you're watching from. We love hearing from our community and exploring forgotten history together. Remember, some stories are too powerful to stay buried, and some ghosts refuse to be forgotten.